Well, welcome back, everybody, or welcome around, everybody, after our short little break here. Virtual folks, we are back here again, so the screen will change shortly, and we're going to get going with our first panel discussion that we're going to be having here. And this is all about abolition in our whole history, as Levada had introduced prior to the break. So I'm going to get started by talking about pre-abolition. In that sense. We'll remind us that the three speakers, we're going to each speak, and then we will open the floor for questions and answers after all three of us speak. And we'll also have time for online questions as well. So those of you out there, is there a chat box, John, that people can ask questions through? There is a chat box, I think, on your WebEx, and you can certainly ask your questions that way, and we will get those questions asked out here as well to the audience. So basically, when we're talking about abolition and our whole history, the question that came to mind for me first was essentially, why are we developing this story at this time? Levada's going to go into much detail about that, but my idea of this is that we've developed this story essentially through a proverb, or at least in part through a proverb. Until the lions have their own historians, tales of the hunt will always glorify the hunter. Now, Professor Chinua Achebe will freely admit that this African proverb long predates his existence on this planet. And as a proverb, I think it's pretty universal, because Winston Churchill and George Orwell both noted that history is written by the winners, or the victors. And even Napoleon, there he goes, even Napoleon is said to state that history is simply lies agreed upon. So history, the way I'm working at it anyway, is an accumulation of perspectives. And the more points of view that we have on the past, the more that we collect different points of view, the more thorough our understanding of the past becomes. So we look to tell the untold and the undertold stories. Now, we're not doing this exclusively. We're in fact doing these untold and undertold stories inclusively, because many of the issues and events and individuals that have shaped New York are not always the issues, the events, and the individuals that we learned about in school. For example, we know that New York sided with the Union, the North, during the American Civil War. New York was, in the 1860s, not classified as a slave state at that time, and New York played a very large part in the fight for freedom, with abolitionists like David Ruggles, Frederick Douglass, freedom fighters like Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth, and John Brown, all living or doing the good work that they did in New York. Through the Our Whole History initiative, however, we are compelled to dig a little deeper. To understand the historic acts of freedom fighters and abolitionists in New York, we must first understand the depth and the breadth of enslavement and resistance in New York. Philipse Manor Hall State Historic Site, a wonderful place that you are here today at, where we are gathered, tells the story of enslavement in New York, so places like the John Brown Farm and the John J. Homestead Historic Site can explain the story of abolition in New York. Philipse Manor Hall interprets the story before abolition. That would be the story of enslavement in colonial New York. And why do we do this? Because to understand where we are, we must first understand where we were. So let's set our Wayback Machine here for the year 1685. Philipse Manor Hall was brand new, in fact. The oldest part of the house here dates back to about 1682. So the house is about 3 years old in 1685. The Philipse family themselves had by this time accumulated more than 50,000 acres of land in Westchester. Since nobody knows what an acre is these days, I'll give you an idea. 50,000 acres of land is about 3.5 times the size of Manhattan. It's a big chunk of land that the Philipses had. The Philipse family themselves had expanded their trade network from dealing with furs up and down the Hudson River at that time to now dealing with provisions and numerous other goods, stopping in ports in Amsterdam, in London, Hamburg, out in Newport News and Charleston, all the way out to Batavia, which is way out in the Indian Ocean, also into Jamaica, Curacao, Barbados. They were involved in the slave trade also across the Atlantic, using the same fleet of cargo ships to pick up African captives on the Cape Coast, Whydah, Loango, Benguela, and Mapindusoyo. And in that year, 1685, the Philipse-owned ship named the Charles sailed from New York to Great Britain. After unloading sundry goods, she took on fresh water and a crew of about 16 men and set sail for the coast of West Africa. The Charles itself sailed along the coast of West Africa to the port of Mapindusoyo, which was at the mouth of the Congo River in central West Africa. And it was there at the port of Soyo that Captain Codringham purchased 146 African captives. Purchasing 146 men and women meant trading manufactured goods like brass, copper, textiles, glassware, and muskets and gunpowder to a very powerful Bakongo king. The men and the women were on board the Charles. They may in fact have been members of the Bakongo themselves, because at that time the Bakongo Empire was in the midst of a very long and very bloody civil war. And oftentimes the losing side of a battle would be captured, and those POWs that were captured were then sold as slaves by the winning side. At least 2/3 of those men taken on board were men, and that'd be about 100 people out of the 146. These men were stripped, shackled at the wrist and feet, taken below deck to the cargo hold. Now, the Charles, as a ship, was known as a pink. It is an ocean-going vessel, not more than 100 feet long, maybe about 25 feet wide at its widest. Below deck were crew quarters and storage. The storage spaces may have been a couple of rooms, not much more than 15 feet by 20 feet. One of those rooms would have been used to store fresh food and fresh water for the voyage. And the other room was for human cargo. Now, if you have a living room in your house, or if you know somebody who has one that's about 15 by 20 feet, try to picture 100 people in that room now. The men were laid down on their backs along the walls of the hold. Then the middle space would have been filled. Even that might not be enough to fit 100 people. So oftentimes there was a half deck built halfway between the upper and the lower deck, maybe about 2.5, 3 feet above the floor. And you would lay down another group of people on that half deck. Maybe you could fit 100 people this way. If you could, then the lower deck would have been filled. But what about the women? Because they're not often in the lower decks. The women, in general, were allowed to remain above deck, where they cooked, where they cleaned, and where they were used at the discretion of this all-male crew. And then the ship would set sail across the Atlantic. Conditions were horrific. Men were held for days, sometimes weeks, below deck in equatorial heat, with no circulating air, no facilities below deck. In good weather, and when not in sight of land, they were led above deck in small groups, 6, 7, 8, 9 people at a time, to basically stretch atrophied muscles, to have the cargo area where they were cleaned, and the crew oftentimes and very quickly would grow fearful of insurrection and contagious diseases under conditions like this. Charles's transatlantic voyage from Mapindusoyo to its first stop across the Atlantic in Barbados took about 12 weeks. At least 41 Congolese captives perished during this 3-month journey across the ocean. And of those 105 survivors to land at Bridgetown, 82 were unloaded and delivered to sugar planters who had probably purchased them sight unseen months earlier. The remaining 23 that were not sold at Bridgetown were considered refuse Negroes, men and women who were too sick, too ill, too weak to be of any value on a sugar plantation. Those 23 then sailed for New York, where another 14 died along the way of that voyage. So all told, of the 146 captives on board the Charles, purchased at Mapindusoyo, 55 individuals died along that journey. That is a loss, statistically wise, which is what they had counted at that time, of 37.6% of the human cargo on board this ship. Near the town of Rye, across the county in Rye, New York, the final 9 survivors disembarked. Of those, a young boy with one eye was sent to Manhattan, and the remaining 8 individuals, Congolese individuals, were taken by Adolph Philipse, son of Frederick Philipse, who was at this house, and marched across the county to begin construction on Phillips's upper Mills quarters in Sleepy Hollow and on Phillips's what they called lower Mills quarters here in Yonkers. Congolese labor built the original part of this house. The wealth of the Philipse family and other aristocratic New York families like the Van Cortlands, the Beekmans, the Livingstons were due in large part to their trafficking in human property. The voyage of the Charles is just one example of the tens of thousands of transatlantic voyages that took place over 4 centuries. Hundreds, in fact, of those voyages began and ended in New York. And it is impossible, I think, to comprehend the size and the scope of the transatlantic slave trade. Even on this one singular voyage of the Charles, we have very little information. We know numbers, we know statistics, but we don't know the names of these individuals, we don't know their ages, we don't know whether there were families on board or whether they were split from families at Mapindusoyo. And unfortunately, this data always consists of just cold, hard facts. To humanize this story, to humanize the story of enslavement in New York, we must look elsewhere to build upon the story of the Charles. And a significant source of that information can be found in the thousands of advertisements that were placed actually in colonial era newspapers. Advertisements were placed for the sale or for the rent of enslaved individuals and for the return of individuals who chose to leave their bondage. However, to find the humanity within these ads, we need to read between the lines. After all, who's writing these advertisements? Individuals that want to get their human property recovered or back. So we only get one side of that story. They're often one-dimensional. But the ads, if you really read them carefully, will show evidence of ongoing resistance by individuals against the institution of slavery, and they allow our visitors a glimpse into the appearance, the skills, the cultures, the education, the personalities, and oftentimes even the motives of those who made such a difficult choice. One ad that we use at Philipse Manor Hall is on the interactive touchscreen downstairs. If you have a chance to see it, you can interact with it. It's in our primary sources gallery. Visitors can select from 4 different primary documents and learn not only about the document in question, but they can get some backstory on the document and learn how historians now can reveal secrets sort of embedded in the text based on kind of the questions that people are asking these days. In a nutshell here, this advertisement is for a man named Galloway. It's dated October 27, 1740. A leather dresser named John Breeze is the man who wrote this ad. And this man, Galloway, made a decision to self-liberate. Breeze paid for this advertisement in the New York Weekly Journal, one of several newspapers covering much of lower New York and eastern New Jersey at the time. And on the surface, the ad itself is fairly typical of its time. The ad mentions something about Galloway's age, mentions his appearance, that he took the road towards New England, which is a clue for where he might have been headed. But it also mentions that Galloway was stopped and questioned at Colonel Phillipse's mill. And that would be here in Yonkers. There was a large milling complex in the front of this house at that time. Now, the fact that he stopped at Philipse Manor Hall is significant. Now, Galloway wasn't taken into custody because he mentioned to whoever had questioned him here at Colonel Phillipse's mill, he mentioned that he was in pursuit of a Cuba man. Now, what does that mean? Well, in the fall of 1740, this would have resonated with the Philipse family or whoever may have stopped and questioned Galloway, because a Cuba man would be a reference to a group of African men or possibly Afro-Spanish sailors who were recently brought to New York City against their will by a local privateer who had captured a Spanish ship at sea. Spanish and the English, they never really got along, so there were oftentimes lots of privateering going on and people were capturing each other's ships. This English captain, Lush, captured a Spanish ship that just happened to have African men or Afro-Spanish men on board. The men claimed to be free. They were Spanish sailors. We were not slaves, is what they said. But a New York Admiralty court determined that these men were, in fact, slaves and therefore could be sold to a number of New York residents. Galloway was smart to mention that he was on a mission to pursue a Cuba man because New York City was justifiably nervous that these Spanish Negroes were angry for being denied their freedom and were looking to cause trouble or to run away. Although Galloway succeeded in getting past the Colonel Phillips and his mill, his escape was ultimately unsuccessful. And here's where kind of the history detective work really gets a lot of fun. We're going to add to the story here. Because researching for enslaved men named Galloway in the 1740s turns up another story. New York's 1741 insurrection conspiracy. So a slave rebellion in New York. This is long before Nat Turner, Gabriel Prosser, Denmark Vesey. There were several attempted insurrections in Manhattan and on Long Island. In the summer of 1741, an enslaved man named Galloway was listed in the judicial records pertaining to this insurrection. It was noted that the man named Galloway, who was being held in prison, had formerly belonged to a leather dresser, the leather dresser being John Breeze. So Galloway was jailed and accused for being a part of this insurrection plot. And sometime, apparently, after his attempted escape, he was captured or returned to his enslaver, John Breeze. Shortly thereafter, John Breeze sold Galloway to a local brewer named Hermanus Rutgers. If you follow the arrow down at the bottom, you see Galloway's name, his enslaver, H. Rutgers. You will also see that Galloway was tried for conspiracy. He was found guilty, and on July 18th, he was hanged for his part in this insurrection conspiracy. But there's even more to the story. So this is the way, all right, you keep digging, you keep finding. More to this story, because one of the leaders in the 1741 conspiracy was a man named Kofi. No doubt he was a con man, who was enslaved by Adolph Phillips. Now, Adolph Phillips was the uncle of Frederick Phillips II, who was the Supreme Court Justice and lived here, yada, yada. Anyway, how much did Galloway know about the plans for insurrection? Did he come to Philipse Manor Hall to deliver a message? Did he choose to leave because he got scared as to what was going on with this conspiracy and wanted to get out of it? We don't have answers to those questions yet. That's the next thing that we need to find out. What did Cuffy know? What did Galloway know? Did they know each other? Did he come here intentionally deliver something to somebody? That's the next step. But it's certainly, no matter whether we have all the answers or not, I think this truly humanizes Galloway. He's more than just a name on a runaway ad. He's more than a name on a judicial record listing those who were executed or found guilty of this conspiracy. This is a man who's much more complex than that. Someone with a backstory, someone more human. And that's what we're looking to talk about at Philipse Manor Hall, the humanity of these individuals. Not only does Philipse Manor Hall note these lesser known but very important historical events, like the Voyage of the Charles, or individuals like that of Galloway, but we also address larger, but again, underreported issues of the day. And one issue is that of freedom. Did you know that during the American Revolution, the British offered freedom to thousands of men, women, who were enslaved by patriots? The British weren't abolitionists, right? They were also enslavers, but they knew how to disrupt the economy of America and strike fear into the hearts of the enemy by aiming or arming the very people who they had enslaved. So here again, Philipse Manor Hall plays a significant role in this history. During the early summer of 1779, Sir Henry Clinton, Commander-in-Chief of His Majesty's forces in North America, he's the George Washington of the British side, okay? He occupied Philipse Manor Hall in Yonkers. Clinton was leading some skirmishes up the road a little bit, and he used Philipse Manor Hall as a temporary headquarters. And it was here at Philipse Manor Hall that Sir Henry Clinton issued what has become known as the Philipsburg Proclamation. The document is short and very succinct. It frees any person of African descent enslaved by a patriot who escapes to British lines. Now, this had perhaps the largest impact on slavery in American colonies of any of the other proclamations that came before it, such as Virginia's Dunmore Proclamations, which some people may have heard about. These documents only freed enslaved men who could bear arms for His Majesty's forces. But the Philipsburg Proclamation goes one better because it declared every Negro who deserted a rebel household or the rebel forces would be freed upon breaching British-controlled territory. And this was interpreted to then include women and children and men unable to enlist. It also covered all of the American colonies, not just Virginia. Whole families could and did escape bondage if they made it to British lines. So while the Philipsburg Proclamation could be perceived maybe as America's first emancipation proclamation, although it was issued by the enemy, interestingly, it was not a universal emancipation. Its promise of freedom did not include those enslaved by loyalists or by any black rebel troops who were captured in battle. But nevertheless, right, jumping forward, nevertheless, at the end of the war in 1783, the British insisted on keeping their promise to free those who ran to British lines. So Americans, and that includes George Washington himself, were outraged that the losers of the war could confiscate what Washington saw as Americans' private property. Now, of course, several of Washington's slaves had run away during the British War, and he certainly wanted his human property returned as well. The British ignored Washington's demands. And on Evacuation Day, which took place on November 25th, 1783, some 3,500 former slaves left New York Harbor with the British, and as many as 15,000, if not more, former slaves left with the British from other American ports at the end of the war. Many were relocated to Nova Scotia, where there still today remains a large African population. And some of those free persons of color in Nova Scotia protested that Nova Scotia was not a great place to live. I love it in the summer up there, but I don't want to spend the winter up there either. Britain chose to relocate some of those individuals from Nova Scotia to settle the free colony of Sierra Leone. Depending on your point of view, then, fighting for freedom and independence in the American Revolution could very well have meant siding with the British. The Philipsburg Proclamation serves in part as a precursor to New York abolition. Through the large-scale manumission of formerly enslaved individuals, though it was not done out of any anti-slavery sentiment or any belief that all men were created equal, but nevertheless, from the point of view of the thousands who were in fact freed, the proclamation served its purpose. Through our whole history, through this initiative that we have, Philipse Manor Hall covers some of the earliest colonial history for a New York State historic site. We work hard to discuss, with sensitivity and with pride, not only the stories of enslaved individuals and the choices that they made, but also the changing roles of women from a Dutch-controlled New Netherland to an English-controlled colonial era. The indigenous Munsee Lenape, who had established fishing villages along the Chattahoochee and Nepperhan rivers. It would be our Sawmill River and our Hudson River. Centuries before Europeans arrived. Learning about these three cultures and how they interacted play a large part in the Philipse Manor Hall exhibit. So I urge you to come and see our whole history as it discovers, uncovers, and recovers the history of New York. I want to thank you for that. We will be holding our questions to the end of the panel, and I would like to ask Jessica Sir-Philippi from Schuyler Mansion State Historic Site to come on up, and she's going to talk a little bit about what's going on a little farther upstate.
everybody. Can you hear me? All right, I know I have a quiet voice. So I'm from Schuyler Mansion in Albany, and today I'm going to take you through a bit of a journey about our programming and how we came to interpret our whole history. And I will tell you that we didn't always get it perfect, but we've definitely learned and grown from our mistakes. All right, so the start of telling the history of the enslaved actually started in the 80s. In the 80s and 90s, site staff began researching through letters, through documents, finding things like shoe repair receipts, compiling all those sources so that we had them all in a single place to learn about the people enslaved by the Schuylers. But the issue is then they put it on a shelf and didn't get taken off the shelf until about 2005, when some of the current staff, like Site Director Heidi Hill, began working there. So they took it off the shelf, but even though they incorporated some of the people they learned about in that research into the tours, they really were there supporting Philip Schuyler. It was still his story, and they were all the supporting cast. That started to change as the staff went to staff developments, to programs, to partnerships, and in 2014, started with The Accused, which Cordell talked a little bit about. So The Accused was the first time that site staff talked about slavery not centered around Philip Schuyler's story. And like Cordell mentioned, there were different people acting out roles, like the Schuylers, their friends, the people enslaved there, free people from Albany, all coming in through the house and talking about the 3 children who had supposedly set the fire in Albany. And the visitors would go to 3 different spaces, hear them talking, and at the end, they weren't given an answer as to what happened. Instead, they were asked, what do you think happened? And could these 3 children have received a fair trial? So this was the start of something we've tried to do at the site too, of not just giving people answers, but helping them come to their own conclusions that we often learn from as well. But all of these programs start with research, so we used the binder and we went from there. So in 2016, we started a blog, which covers a lot of different topics like the restoration of the house, the women that lived there, military, and of course the people who were enslaved by the Schuylers. And one of our earliest posts from 2016 was called Who Were the Servants, Lisbon, Dick, and Bob? And our former employee, Ian Mumpton, he wrote this blog post about the 3 individuals based really on just one letter we had describing them as going up to Schuyler's Saratoga house and cutting down timber. He did a great job in using what we had, learning about who they were, what their work may have been, what their day may have been like. And then 8 years later, one of our current employees, Sarah Lindecki, took that and built on it. And she started looking into what were their social lives like. How could they socialize during the time that they were in Saratoga, but also along the way? Who may they have seen? How would the weather conditions impact this? And both of these are really great if you want to read them on our blog, but it's a really cool example of how history grows and changes, even just within 8 years from 2 different staff members. And a lot of that research has gone into so many different aspects of what we do at the site. And I'm going to start with Prince. So you can see on the screen there, we have a video depicting Prince, who was Schuyler's head enslaved servant. And that started as research, but we didn't know a lot about Prince to begin with. We had some references from the Schuyler family, which is interesting because they never reference any of the other people enslaved there by name. At least in the way they were, as remembering him or asking about him. We also knew that he wrote a letter. We didn't know if he personally wrote it or had it written for him from jail, in which he asked to be enslaved by the Schuylers. And that was all the context we had. But in 2020, Ian once again was doing some research, and he found things that just put the whole story together. He was able to find that Prince had been enslaved by a man in Canada who was an officer in the British Army. When he was captured by the Americans, Prince was captured too, and they were forced to march from Canada, and they were headed to New Jersey. The weather was turning cold. Prince in the letter states he didn't have adequate clothing, that he was suffering from frostbite. So when they reach Albany and are put in jail there, Prince is facing the horrible decision of trying to continue that march and possibly dying, or asking a wealthy family like the Schuylers to be enslaved by them. And without that context, it's a very confusing story. So after that, we were able to recreate a video we had about Prince, in which, in the original video, Prince talked about his work as a head enslaved servant for the Schuylers and how that sometimes alienated him from the other enslaved people because they weren't sure if they could trust him. And because the way we wrote it really had Prince talking to visitors and trying not to say things that might upset the Schuylers, it came across as a bit confusing to our modern day visitors, wondering why he was speaking of them and not really of his own agency. So once this new research was done and we had a grant to add some more videos to this project, we redid Prince's video with the original actor, and that's now on display in our visitor center. One of the other big ways our research has impacted what we do there is through the search for Silva. Silva was a woman enslaved by the Schuylers starting in the 1790s, and she was enslaved there alongside her husband Toby and their 3 kids, Tally-Ho, Tom, and Hanover. Now, we knew that they were purchased in the 1790s and that Silva and her kids were freed when Schuyler died in 1804. Toby, from a letter we believe, died before that time. But that was really all we knew to begin with. So then we set off on a quest to find out how she built a life for herself once she was free. And it took like 2 years of research, and we can't say that we definitely found her, but a lot of what we found really points to this woman being the Silva, once enslaved by the Schuylers. She lived in Albany. She actually was a homeowner living on land formerly owned by Philipse Schuyler, right down the road from Schuyler Mansion. She had the same name, she was the right age for the amount of time that passed, and she was of African descent. She had people living in her household who would have matched the ages of her children. So we found that census, but censuses alone aren't really enough. We found another source to go along with it, which is a directory of businesses. We found the same woman owned a business as a fortune teller, which is a pretty cool story, and that business was in operation for almost 20 years in Albany. So we wanted to bring Silva's story into our interpretation, so we added it to our general tours, but then in 2023, we got the awesome opportunity to develop a school tour. And this school tour was developed through a grant that Cherry Hill Historic Site in Albany had. We worked with them, the Stephen and Harriet Myers residents, and what the project was telling a story about women and enslaved women at each site. So we highlighted 3 different individuals, and Silva was one of them. Now, we talked about her life while she was enslaved and how we infer that maybe she was the cook and maybe she was teaching her daughter Tally-Ho how to do that as well. Maybe her son Tom served people in the dining room, but we knew her husband Toby was a carriage driver because we had multiple letters that reference that. And the way that we told this story to the kids was through an activity. So we gathered different objects that Silva and her family members may have owned, and we presented them to the kids. We talked about what each of them were, and then we said, all right, we want you to tell us who each object belonged to. And there is no wrong answer, as long as you can give us a good reason for your interpretation. We were turning them into little historians. So they discuss among themselves, sometimes they fight over it, and at the end, they put all the magnets of the objects on a board under each person's name. And we go through, well, why did you give Toby the mallet? And why did you give Tally-Ho a toy mouse to play with? We got really cool answers. One of the ones I remember is when they couldn't decide who to give the bag of marbles to because they thought, well, the whole family could play them together. So they taught us a lot through this program as well. And this program is still ongoing. It actually was piloted that year, and then over this past year, we got all 500 of Albany's 5th graders to come through it, which was really cool. And we're going to keep doing it this year as well. One of the other ways that we've used some of the research we're talking about is in exhibits, and kind of connecting our school tour to this exhibit is a woman named Diana. Diana's featured in our school tour. She's featured in a video exhibit. Here you can see Hope Anthony playing her, and she's featured in Seizing Liberty, which I'll talk about in a moment. Diana was a woman who was enslaved by the Schuyler's and who we had one single letter about. And that letter was about her recapture after she had attempted to escape slavery. We learned from it that she attempted to escape in one of the coldest winters in American history, that she made it to a man we believe was a tenant farmer living near Schuyler's Saratoga home, and they specifically referenced her as being near the home of a British captain. So with all these context clues, we began to put together maybe Diana had gone to this tenant farmer to go to the British, because a lot of tenant farmers were loyalists, and they could find their freedom there. We don't know that that's definitely the case, but we do know that Diana was recaptured, and that's how this whole story gets told to us. And as of now, we don't definitely know what happened to her, though I'm going to come back to that a bit later on. So we talk about Diana with the school kids, and we decided we were going to introduce the idea of agency to them, which is difficult for even adults to grasp, but these kids do get it, and they teach us along the way as well. And we brought Diana's story into an exhibit called Seizing Liberty, which is about 5 individuals who were once enslaved by the Schuyler's, who all seek their freedom during the Revolutionary War. Diana is the only woman we know of ever to try to escape slavery from the Schuyler's. There's also the stories of Dick, Klaus, Adam Way, and Scipio. Adam Way escaped slavery and made it to Nova Scotia at the age of 80, and he's featured in this exhibit. And the cool thing about the exhibit is it was really only intended to be up for the 4th of July as a kind of counter-narrative to, like, we're celebrating the Americans, but wait, what about the loyalists and, people of African descent who wouldn't find freedom with the Americans? But it's such a good exhibit that we've kept it up almost all year for like 2 years now. And people love it on our tours. We use it with the school kids. But because you can see it's not that big, we can also bring it to different places when we're there tabling. And Cordell talked a bit about this as well, the Schuyler Flats Burial Project, which took place in 2016. So the remains of 14 people once enslaved by Philip Schuyler's aunt were found up in Colony. And after about 10 years of the New York State Museum trying to learn more about these individuals, it was decided they would be laid to rest at St. Agnes Cemetery. The whole community came together to celebrate them, and that included woodworkers who made the coffins you see there, school children, museum professionals, funeral directors, teachers, all came together to make this a meaningful and impactful event and to really celebrate the lives of these 14 individuals. And one of the logistics that goes into this, Cordell talked about just how many people were there, is one of the community members was able to get CDTA buses to bring people from Schuyler Mansion to the cemetery. And on a personal note, I was not working here yet at the time, but I saw this on the news. I was an intern at another site, and seeing this made me want to work at Schuyler Mansion. So I ended up here. Now, one of our ongoing programs is Pinkster. So Pinkster has been celebrated annually at Schuyler Mansion since 2022. And while we celebrate, of course, the historical aspect of the holiday, one thing we really wanted to focus on was bringing the community around us to the holiday as well. And that meant, we go into the community, we become part of the community, and we talk about why this is relevant to them. And we would have community members come be performers, run a drum making workshop. One community member brought her book she wrote about Pinkster last time and was selling it there. We have food trucks from the Albany area as well that all connect to different parts of African culture. And it's a great chance for everyone to come see Schuyler Mansion, sometimes for the first time. We keep the event free, accessible, open to the public, and always hope that it's a starting point for people coming to learn more about us. And all this accumulates into a focus tour that we've been developing called Hear Them Now, which is all about the people who were enslaved by the Schuyler's. This took years to develop, and it was workshopped plenty of times. Levada and Cordell were part of our workshopping of it, and it's still not perfect. We're still learning more as we give it. We'll actually start giving it again this coming season in February. But just to highlight a few of the aspects of it, we make this as interactive as possible. So on the bottom there, you'll see a quote. That's an image of one of our quote cards. So when people come on this tour, they are part of it. We have quotes from sometimes the Schuyler's or from other people in Albany, other sources, and we ask our group to read them and then talk about these quotes and how they fit into the narrative. So this one right here mentions Prince, we talked about earlier, and it also mentions the holidays preventing, the horses is coming up sooner, the scaffolding is coming up sooner. Now, there are two holidays that we find reference in these. This one, I believe, is actually the New Year, and then we found reference to Pinkster. So we use that. We use objects, like we have a Pinkster drum, a gourd shaker. People interact with it just as much as they're hearing from us. The images you see of the church there are something we're looking to create to add to this tour and our programming. So the painting is the Albany Dutch Reformed Church, as it appeared pre-1790, and then the carving next to it is a carving from the attic of Schuyler Mansion, where the enslaved people largely lived. So we believe this carving was done by someone enslaved there, and while we don't know who that is, we use this to tell the story of a man named Will, who was enslaved by the Schuylers, but had a wife named Britt who was enslaved by another family in Albany. We know about their family because they baptized their two children, Susanna and Harry, at the Dutch Reformed Church. And that church was actually right in the middle of the two places they lived. So that was literally their meeting point. And once we found this carving, we knew we had to bring it into the story, whether or not Will was the person who carved it. It shows us just how important of a space the church was. And what we're hoping to do, aside from just having this image, which is currently part of the tour, is to actually turn it into a facsimile of the carving so that people can interact with it, can feel it, because we can't take people up to the attic. Ian's excited. So we can't take people up to the attic, but this way we can bring some of that to them. So this tour, like I said, is going to come back in February, and we hope that you can come. Kind of to come to a conclusion, you've seen what we're doing currently and have done in the past, so what are we going to do from here? Well, we're doing a lot of research. So the woman you see on the screen here, her name is Martha Church. She was enslaved by Philip Schuyler's grandson, Philip Church, out in Angelica, New York. There's this painting of her done by a French refugee when she was going through that area. And this is really all we know of her, so we're trying to research more about what her life may have been like out in Angelica. We're also using some letters that we've recently acquired to add to our research. We have one written by Angelica Schuyler, the oldest Schuyler daughter, in which she uses the word servant and slave interchangeably. And this is a chance for us to give the public coming to the site an answer to a question they often ask. They will ask us, well, how do you know servant refers to an enslaved person? And this letter shows us how the Schuylers and people of their class were using those words interchangeably. So that's going to be some research coming out on our blog, but also getting worked into our tours. You can also see on the screen, we have what looks like a census. It is a census, and highlighted is a man called Jim Schuyler. We learned about Jim through a descendant, not of the Schuylers, but of one of the people they enslaved. His name is Larry Schuyler, and he came to one of our family reunions. So Larry told us about the DNA genealogy that he had done, so we used that information, and we learned that his ancestor was called Jim from Africa in the 18th century. We know he was enslaved by the Schuylers. We actually have his name in some of our documents. But by 1810, he was living in Easton, New York, on former Schuyler land as the head of his household with his family. So while we still haven't been able to connect all the way back to Larry, we're missing about a generation or two, This is a new way that we're learning about the people enslaved by the Schuyler's and meeting some of their descendants as well. We're also developing a new exhibit you can see there about the 5th of July. So I'm sure Levada is going to talk about the 5th of July. I won't go into it too much, but it's the anniversary of the end of abolitionism in New York in 1827. So what we wanted to do is connect it to the site and to Albany. How is it relevant to the people who were once enslaved by the Schuyler's? And while we have just a small exhibit now, we're looking to expand it because we're also looking to celebrate the 5th of July in 2027. Instead of having our big 4th of July event that brings in a couple hundred people, it's a community event that everyone knows about, that year we're going to switch it to July 5th so we can talk to our community about that holiday and how important that holiday is and celebrate it that year instead. So kind of in conclusion, you can see we've done a lot. This was done over the course of many years, and like I said, we didn't get it right. We've taken criticism, and we love criticism. We love to learn and grow, and I hope that this shows you can research history that some people might see as impossible. It's not impossible. Sometimes you just have to look in places that you don't often think of. Thank you.
Abolition and our whole history. Abolition is a word that many of us are kind of confusing these days. One of the things, a project that I'm working on, an initiative for parks that comes off of the Our Whole History concept, is specifically geared towards 2027. Enslavement to freedom, 1627, 1827, to 2027 is a multi-year interpretive, commemorative, and public series of programs and activities and so much more. Why is abolition so challenging? New York does not have a direct and easy and smooth way of freeing the enslaved. There are two pieces of legislation that are involved. The 1799 Gradual Abolition Act. It is full of clauses, and it does not have an ending date for legal slavery. The 1817 Act for Servants and Slaves will change the age when people can be freed, will allow people to be freed who were not included in the 1799 Act, and it gives an end date of July the 4th, 1827. But because of the numerous clauses in the 1799 legislation, a piece of legislation that was designed to not end slavery in New York until 1848. Because of all of those clauses, many people will remain in bondage as bound servants. The last person freed in New York will be a man named Caesar in 1841. Current research shows that there was a woman in Putnam Valley and a gentleman in Bethlehem, New York, who may never have been freed. Our project goal is to bring the latest research, information that we are learning on a daily basis, to the broadest audience possible, to finally, in a systematic way, work with the historic sites that are stewarded by parks. Of the 35 sites, 15 of them fall within the colonial and New Nation periods. to take the history work, the research that they are doing, and to slide in critical missing pieces of information, to bring that to the public, to educators, to even our colleagues in the history world, so that we can continue to create a concise story that the public hears as they travel to different parts of New York. Again, these key anniversaries, the 400th anniversary of New Netherlands, the 400th of New Amsterdam, the 250th of the Rev War, and 2027, July 4th and 5th, and the August 29th date. The Act of 1817 gives us July 4th as the legal end of slavery. However, the community was very, very concerned about reprisals. This dialogue shows up in historic newspapers, it shows up in diaries and letters and other exchanges during the period. What ultimately happens is on the 4th, many of the celebrations were very low-key. They were held in churches. They were more like lectures and programs. And then on the 5th is when you have the parades and where the people will take to the street and party. 2027 gives us the opportunity to repeat that pattern because July 4th actually falls on a Sunday, meaning that many people will be off on July the 5th, that Monday. Our narrative timeline, New York's history, particularly again, beginning in that New Netherlands period, is relatively new to many people, and we want to take this as an opportunity to start having people brought up to speed. So we're looking at several different areas. We're looking first at the very beginning, that's 1624 to 1663. That we call a traveling exhibit that we're producing, Poisonous Seeds, laying the foundation, getting things moving that will remain in place. It is through this work that we are hoping to correct a common misunderstanding in New York where people say that there was a Dutch system and there was a British system of enslavement. In fact, there is not. There is one system of enslavement that will continue to grow, develop, and change over the years. In our education of the periods of slavery here in the United States, many of us, all of our education through the public system jumps us into the period where all of the Northern European countries who are involved in enslavement are at their height. They have worked out the kinks. The period that we often negate are the first years, where the Dutch, the Portuguese, the Spanish, the British, and the French are figuring it out. How do you move hundreds of people from Africa to the New World and not have them die on the way? How do you feed them? Where do you get the food? How do you set up a marketplace? How do you negotiate? How does an owner of a ship start getting individual funding so he can afford to build the crew and the things that he needs for this transaction to happen? All of those foundations are laid during the Dutch period. Then we get into the British and the crafting of and resisting of a slave economy. Are we a society with slaves, or are we a slave society? Again, that evolution of that story. When we get into the Rev War years, of course, that fight for freedom. You have enslaved people in houses listening to their owners speak about the displeasures they have with the British government, hearing both from loyalists and from the patriot rebels. Hearing this, having those discussions among themselves. What does this mean to us? We have both enslaved and free Africans and their descendants on both sides fighting. This is a continuation, again, of a foundation that is set up during the Dutch period, where the Dutch relied on the enslaved Africans to act as soldiers. They appear in the Escopus Wars, and they will even appear after the Revolution during the War of 1812. What is freedom? We use the word emancipation loosey-goosey, but in fact, manumission, abolition, and emancipation are legal terms. They do not reference the same thing. They cannot be used interchangeably. Manumission, to free someone that you own. An owner is letting someone go while slavery is still the law of the land. Abolition, the legal end of slavery, but that does not always include the freeing of people. It is as the law will end. Emancipation, when someone else frees an enslaved person that you may own or someone may have owned, again, while slavery is still the law of the land. Many of us grew up with a misunderstanding of even the Emancipation Proclamation, believing that that document ended legal slavery, freed everyone. However, it only freed those from states that had seceded from the Union. It is not until the 13th Amendment that the law of slavery ends. What happens when humans are reclassified from property to people? Transition, and the abolition movement from New York now going on to the national stage, the international stage. What happens here when people now have to find places to live, find places to work, find ways to educate their children? There is a heavy emphasis on the community within New York City, but there are thousands of newly freed above mid-Hudson Valley going towards the Canada border. It is shortly during that period of the Gradual Abolition Act in Western and Central New York, lands opened up because of the Sullivan and Clinton campaign, that we also have Southerners bringing enslaved people up into that region, hoping to start Southern-style plantations. But suddenly, they are now having to free those people. Those communities, not just the ones in New York, but those communities up the Hudson River, up the Mohawk, all the way to Canada, are the support system for the Southern freedom seekers as they work their way through the state. For it is common to hear people say, as they interpret or we interpret the Underground Railroad period, that people were able to hide in plain sight. How can they hide in plain sight if there are not other Black people already there? Where do they come from? There are numerous deliverables that we will be sharing. We are planning 3 temporary exhibits, again, touching on stories that may be mentioned within a particular site that we feel need to be expanded. Here at Philipse Manor, we're going to look at New York connections to the Caribbean and the West Indies. From very early, not just with Curaçao, that is the Dutch base, but landowners, individuals here in New York will end up owning property and sugar plantations or investing in those sugar plantations in Jamaica, in Barbados, and there's a going back and forth between the Caribbean and New York that has a Caribbean flair in New York very early. Many of our sites are now sitting in the middle of mixed communities, many of them rich in people from the Caribbean and the West Indies. Their story connecting to New York is not new. Our whole history allows us to delve into the records and show that presence, show those ships going back and forth, show the movement of those people, as well as the economic links for things like our wheat that impacts the Caribbean and West Indies, particularly during those naval blockades, during the Rev War, where New York wheat doesn't make it there, and literally people will starve. Lorenzo, that central region, opening up for Southerners, but also here we have a very unique story that the documents are starting to show us. When I initially sketched out the temporary exhibit, I wanted to tell that Southern story. But the documents are showing something very different. We have a childless couple living in this house. They have responsibility of raising 5 children that are not their own. 3 of them are enslaved, 11, 9, and 4 years old. The other 2, one is the wife's half-brother and another family member. Here we have an opportunity to look at the presence of children in the slave trade, and a conundrum that comes up repeatedly in documents where women in New York are charged with raising children as young as 3 years old that are enslaved. How do they do that? How do they manage that? How do we start creating a system of separation, even while they are charged with having to teach all of them to read, to write? There's never any literacy laws in New York, so this is an opportunity for us to step in and see the foundations that we have of a newly free society where you have both newly freed who are literate, those that are not, and what those initial steps into the education systems can be. John Brown Farm gives us an opportunity to take a closer look at how New Yorkers step into supporting that national movement. We have not only the collection from John Brown, but also a collection of amazing documents from the William J. collection, as the J family supports as acting as lawyers for people who are caught in this system in New York. Then we have John Brown, who is there to support those who will get, hopefully, their right to vote and full citizenship because of the Garrett Smith land grants. Taking a look at that story, expanding it out. 6 traveling exhibits. All of the traveling exhibits will be free to other historic organizations, libraries, and educational facilities that would like to use them. We're starting with the 2 right now, Poisonous Seed, and also taking a expanded story we have, redefining the family, that is currently on display at Claremont Historic Site. My colleagues spoke to DNA, now verifying what has been oral tradition in many families. Chris Rapp, a descendant of a branch of the Livingston family, within his family, he had heard about his great-great-grandmother. There were letters written by the family. He, at the request of his grandmother, picked up that genealogical research, broadened it, proved it, shared it with the Livingston family at one of their reunions, And eventually, once DNA testing became available, he and a cousin did that, showed up a match. So now we can tell this story, starting to show how many people are caught up in that two lines of a family rooted in New York and being able to embrace that now as a full and complete family. We are also going to be doing work with an online exhibit. E-Museum, we have a new database at the Resource Center, which allows us to share with the public the collection of the state's material collection that is housed within our Prairie View. We are now going to take information that we have and create an exhibit around enslavement and show that out so people can see the material culture that we have. So for researchers and others, not just in the state, but around the country and around the world, to be able to connect New York to the greater presence of enslaved Africans and their descendants, not just here, but taking us back to Africa as well. With our partners at the State Museum, we are doing several things, and those partnership projects I'll go into a little bit further. A variety of programs will be available based on the research that we are doing. The wonderful opportunities that we have within the state park system is that we have research happening on two levels. We have it happening both at the historic site and at the resource center. The historic sites do an amazing job while they're also dealing with school programs and the general public and the running of things on the day-to-day. At the research center, our purpose is to really support their work, but also gives us additional time to do even deeper research, both for the exhibits and to help them expand the stories that they are working on as well. So we're back and forth with each other on the phones. They have questions, we have questions, and together, working as a unified team allows us more time to go into the nuances. But it is important when we do this research not to work in a vacuum. We need the conversations. You need to think through the ideas. You need help. Does this make sense? Is it consistent with what we're seeing across the state, across the region? It is not just about picking up a letter, discovering something new, and stepping out on a limb out here by yourself. With the variety of colleagues that we have, both in the archaeological field, our curators, our staffs at the various sites, working with the State Archive, other historic organizations like the Public Library, New York Historical Society, and so many others, we can then verify what we're saying. We can work it together so when we share with the public, we can step out doing so with confidence. All of that work ends up in a variety of programs that we have and will be offering. Professional development. One of the things that everyone is clear on is that the average teacher teaching history in New York does not know the Dutch period. And that is because a lot of this research is brand new. And with all they have to do and all they have to manage, expecting them to sit down and read these long, dense papers, honestly, it's just asking a bit much. So working with my colleagues at the New York State Museum's Education Department, as well as Consider the Source New York, a program out of the Archive Partnership Trust. We are working together to build a clear and concise professional development program specifically for the new research around New Netherland. We will then have a program where teachers can come and get continuing ed credits for this work, and we can continue to update this information as academics are delving even deeper and into this information so we can move it from the academy down to the teachers so they can use references that are specifically for New York, as opposed to having to pull on Southern subject matter that may not be applicable. Our GIS story maps are growing. We'll be developing one around the gradual act of abolition and the pushing against civil rights. When we think about civil rights, most of us consider the 1960s as the beginning of that movement. But we are looking at a different view. What happens, again, when humans are reclassified from property to people? Suddenly, there may be an impact on their civil rights, their human rights, their right to vote. Black men are disenfranchised during the period of gradual abolition with the passing of the state's second constitution. Immediately, all these people who were looking for full freedom are cut short. What does that mean? Through an ArcGIS map, we're going to start exploring that, one that will allow that story to go out along with so many documents and research that we have been working on. Archaeological survey. Throughout the state, including within the state's collection, artifacts have and are lingering and there that speak directly to African cultural traditions being maintained in our region. Right now, there is one database that started out of one of the universities in the South that has been collecting this information, and it shows no state above Delaware. Whether that is in the state's collection or other private and public museums here in the state, archaeologists are finding everything from shells to offerings to the Orisha Esu, to crystals, to those corn cobs in the Lots House, which a New Jersey historian referenced because they recently found a similar display in the floorboard of our house in New Jersey. By the sharing of this information, we can now look to Black scholars around the world and other scholars who are studying these traditions to help us clarify this and share this, to again show that cultural presence very early from material that we already have. Across the state, again, there are some foundational things that are just missing that we are really hoping the Enslavement to Freedom program will put into place. One is we do not have a singular database that collects all of the information we can have on burial grounds and cemeteries that fall between the 17th and the 19th century. The transition from unmarked graves to graves marked with field stones, some carved with African symbolism on them, to granite headstones, to later cement headstones. All of that information helps people who want to be the stewards of those places to be able to maintain them in artifact status. But work is happening, but in silo situations. We are hoping to bring people together to create community around these locations and around what are good practices, to try to get more of these locations on the National Register, which means that working together, we can do the research for that to be able to happen. We're also hoping future funding will allow us during this period to do a simple conference so everyone can sit together or join us virtually and in person, again, creating those partnerships, creating the bridges that means that there will be legacy for these locations in the future. The ringing of the bells, 1 minute, 12 noon, July 5th. Is something that we're hoping, and in a communication with people right now, a roundtable discussion about this is coming up in December, because we would like, at the end of 2027, to finally have that question or that disbelief, there was slavery in New York, to stop. And all of it requires marketing, promotions, and talk. Thank you.
Does anybody have any questions for Lovato or Jesse or myself? We gonna give a microphone out to everybody? Yeah, so the folks online can also hear you.
Check, check. There we go. All right, so if anybody has a question, yes. We're bringing the microphone to you.
So this question is for Jesse. Jesse, I took note of the fact that, you know, the story sort of changes over time as you get new information, find a reference in a letter, things of that sort. I'm just wondering, do you guys use any sort of artificial intelligence to help sort of gather, because there's so many letters, so many documents to look at, but using artificial intelligence to sort of bring it all together or to query some massive database would be pretty helpful, I would think.
Okay. So that's a good question. We have never used AI. Honestly, with our small staff, I think getting started with that would be a journey itself, but part of the issue is these sources aren't always online. Like, we have them printed out, we have them in microfilm. While one of my coworkers actually just yesterday was working on some of the digitization, it's not quite there yet. So it's a good question. We're a little bit behind, you know, the rest of the world.
Any other questions? Yeah.
Hello. Okay. I noticed from your pictures of that the slaves were neatly dressed, smartly dressed. How were the other people? It gives the impression that the slaves were happy. They were all smartly dressed. How were the other people who were field hands and other one? How were they treated?
The clothes, one of the things that we always have to remember is that when we look at period illustrations, those are special occasions. But there are laws in New York about how you have to clothe an enslaved person, how you have to provide shoes for them. And these laws actually start during the Dutch period, because there were a couple of people, one man in particular in Albany, who did not feed his enslaved women, did not clothe them well, and they were out on the street begging. And the community got angry about it. So laws were put in place. There is a minimum of care that has to happen for the enslaved people. That does not include, however, that does not negate corporal punishment, because the law also says you can punish them to the point of death, but legally you cannot kill them. So how they dress depends on the type of work that they are doing, because if they are domestic servants within the house, they're going to be dressed better because they are interacting with guests. If they're working out in a field, they would then have on work clothes. So even as a historian who wears period clothing for various programs, I have different sets. If I'm cooking outside, I am in typical work gear. which would actually emulate exactly what the European women are wearing. It would be a short 3/4 length type of blouse, a wool or heavy cotton skirt, and an apron, shoes, hats. We know that they had blankets because we can look in the account books and see what was purchased for them. So and this is part of that necessity of separating Southern history from New York history. Because we can't look at references for how Southern enslaved were clothed, housed, fed. That does not always apply in New York. We have to look at New York resources to bring that information forward.
Well, some of the photographs that we had of reenactors that were about to do their theatrical piece, it shows you how they're dressed, but it doesn't show you what they're thinking or what they're saying within the context of their story. So they may be dressed quite well. They may even be smiling for the camera because they're only posing, but it doesn't really get into what they're discussing and how upsetting some of that story may be, regardless of how a person is dressed. If you're still an unfree individual and your family is to be separated from, they're not going to be, what they're dressed isn't going to be showing you what they're feeling.
And also, if I may, one of the things that I think that we all need to be conscious of, when we choose not to allow the enslaved to smile, when we choose to not allow them to experience joy, when we choose to keep them at their most brutal, we continue to dehumanize them. We have to allow for full human emotional expression. Why? Because it was there. Our records and research do not indicate thousands of mentally ill, crazy Black people running around. It's not in the documents. If we want to treat them, to bring their humanity forward, we have to allow for pride. If someone has trained for a skill, I'm a culinary historian, so I think of the cooks. If they have been training as a cook, one of the heaviest and most dangerous jobs that can be had, at what point can they transition from this is a job that I have to do? Yes, I have to do, but I also enjoy doing. Because that pride of work moves you from a mediocre cook to a good cook, to a great cook. Without that personal pride, we would not have documents that speak to these amazing meals that they experienced at the enslavers' tables. So in all of this, as we are expanding the stories, as we are looking at the cultures, we also have to say, if an enslaved woman did not love her children, if she did not cry or love them and want to care for them, why do records indicate her anger and her frustration when they are taken away? All of this are the kinds of nuances that as historians, we are looking at on a daily basis. But humanizing the enslaved really includes allowing them to experience that full range of human emotions that all people have.
Any questions from our online audience? Nothing yet. All right. Come on, folks, get chatty, get chatty.
We're only going to take one more, because otherwise we're not going to have time for lunch.
We got lunch.
So.
Mine is a side question. Were the children of the enslaved baptized?
In some cases, yes, and in some cases, no. But we have baptismal records showing up in the Dutch Reformed Church. We have them showing up in the Anglican churches as well.
Okay, that was a nice short one, so we'll take one more.
Having read historian Vincent Brown's recent book on Tacky's Revolt, he forces us to expand our lens further to the wider Atlantic world. And he is actually asking us to look through the lens of warfare and kind of taking this African-based warfare and exporting it to the New World and examining the fuller story through that particular lens. But how will these upcoming celebrations, especially here at Philipse Hall, how will we be, broadening our horizons and looking at that wider Atlantic world to make those nuanced connections that you've been speaking to?
Well, first I have to say we're not celebrating, we're commemorating, and there is a difference. Reconnecting New York to the Caribbean, bringing in those foundational years will reconnect us to that larger transatlantic and the Atlantic world overall. One of the things that has been typical within the United States is that we have always connected enslavement to the Southern story, to the Civil War. So we're missing those early foundational years of that. One of the things we also, when we work at individual historic sites, we tend to think of our people as local folks, right? Like the Phillipses were operating here, but they were an international family. So just putting their full lives back on display really reconnects us. And if we do that at every site, then we reestablish those connections and those patterns really that existed from the Dutch period all the way through.
Okay, last call. I'll take it. All right, I think we're going to go ahead and break for lunch. Folks online, did I miss one? Okay, one more.
I guess I'm not seeing. Okay, I'm going back to the question I asked first. I see that it seems that the slaves in New York were maybe treated differently than in the South. So my next question is, did any slaves in New York run away?
Yes, ma'am. Thousands of them did. And we have one book, particularly around the Hudson River Valley, called In Defiance, that is full with thousands of runaway ads. We have them showing up in newspapers in Western New York and Central New York. And I don't mean to say that they were treated that much differently, but the structure under which they existed was different. In many Southern situations, the enslaved are held in the hundreds together. Here in New York, the average enslaver is holding anywhere from 1 to 3 people. So they are in situations where they're very isolated. That's one of the things I believe plays into hundreds of them showing up at Pinkster celebrations, because it is rare that they have an opportunity to gather in more than just 1 or 2. In fact, New York law says very early that no more than 3 can gather together, particularly in the evening. Burials even had to be done during the day. So there are differences in structure that really impact how the societies form and move. Particularly like here in New York, there is no breeding society. They do not want people to have all these children around them, so they gift children away very early, away from the mothers very early. So getting that clarity of understanding that each state in the 13 colonies, particularly where there was enslavement, each state has its own particular story and its own particular methodology of how the institution of slavery played out in that place and space. And our unique story has been covered up. And it is our hope that we can now bring our story forward, because in telling that story, it will help us see the thousands that were enslaved here.